Hello!
So here we are at the first of several videos devoted to Unit 1 material. This video will cover the first two groups of words on the Unit 1 study guide. The word nation does not technically mean the same thing as state or country, although that's how a lot of people use it. Technically, it means that it's simply a group of people with some distinct commonality, a language in common or other cultural characteristic in common. Could be an ethnic group, anything that group of people bound by their race or their language or religion or ethnicity. A state, which is technically not necessarily the same thing as a nation, must have four features: land, people, a government, and there's the definition right there, and it must have sovereignty. Sovereignty is independent legal authority over itself, supreme or independent authority over itself, and it helps to have recognition by other countries in order for a country to be considered a sovereign state. Here's the definition, according to the College Board, of a state. Any of these definitions will do. Now, we informally use the word state in a variety of ways. It is usually used to refer to the national government of a country. Often is used to refer to a country itself. And as we've discovered and talked about in class a lot, a state is not necessarily coincident with a nation. If it is, we call it a nation state, but that is not always the case. As we discussed in class, there are many examples of nations without states: Palestinians, Kurds, Tibetans, Kosovars, Catalonians, and Native American tribes. There you go. This issue would never, of course, come up on an AP Comparative Government course, but just to remind you, we continue to use the word state to refer to the subdivisions within our country because once upon a time they were states, independent sovereign nations. After we wrote the Constitution, they were no longer completely sovereign, but only semi-sovereign. However, we still continue to use the word state to refer to areas such as Virginia or Maryland. But it's a little weird because the rest of the world uses the word differently than us. However, certain countries do. India has states, Germany has states, Mexico has states, Nigeria has states. I guess we started a trend to some degree, but still, the word state is used slightly differently in this country than it is in most other countries. I doubt seriously you would ever be, required to define all three of these words separately, but just in case you find it interesting, these words are technically different. Power is the ability to get someone else to do what you want. Authority is the right to use that power. And legitimacy is the belief among the people that the government has authority or the right to rule over them. There are many sources of legitimacy. One is what's called rational legal authority or rule of law. Basically, it's a well-established set of laws and procedures and stable institutions which carry on functions over time. Great Britain can be said to have legitimacy based on rational legal authority. Mexico has been around, operating under its constitution for over 100 years, so has a good, strong claim to rational legal authority as a source of legitimacy. Russia hasn't been around that long, at least under its current constitution, only about 20-something years. But to the degree that even someone as powerful as Putin himself bothers to abide by the Constitution shows that there is legitimacy to be gained by following the Constitution. On the second bullet on this slide specifically uses the word Constitution, so it's a perfect example of rational legal authority. And so the College Board would accept it as a separate identification of a source of legitimacy on its own. Tradition. can be another source of legitimacy. And another, again, Great Britain is a great example of legitimacy based on tradition, in that the royal family that has been around hundreds of years, not that it has much power anymore, but to the extent that it does have power, the monarchy in Great Britain is a great example of legitimacy based on tradition. Other sources of legitimacy can include the charisma of an individual leader. Maybe a good example these days would be Russia, in that Putin himself has created a bit of a cult of personality based around himself, obviously. Iran, not that there's a particularly charismatic leader alive currently in Iran, but to the extent that they keep the memory of the original Ayatollah Khomeini alive and in the people's minds, it can be Iran can be an example of charisma-based legitimacy. And China, not that any current or recent presidents have been all that charismatic, but to the extent that they keep alive the memory of Mao Zedong, and keep his personality and his accomplishments alive in the minds of the people, China can, to some degree, be an example of legitimacy based on charisma. Belief systems, ideologies, founding myths, legitimacy can be based on those things also. For example, when it comes to ideology, obviously China is much of the legitimacy of its current government is based on the communist theory, stretching back to Marx. A founding myth, we'll get to that on another slide, but any sort of story of how a state came into existence, for example, in the United States. Not that it's that important anymore, but we do go to some trouble in this country to keep alive the memory of our Revolutionary War heroes and George Washington and all that stuff. So even in the United States, we can find evidence of legitimacy based on founding myths. Closely related would be references in a country to a particular revolution. In Iran, the overthrow of the Shah. In China, the winning of the Civil War by Mao and the overthrow of the nationalists are good examples of founding myths that can be translated into an actual event that can be described as revolution. So Iran and China would be good examples of legitimacy that can be traced back to a particular event or revolution in the recent past of a country. Religion is another example of a belief system or ideology, so it would be acceptable as a source of legitimacy according to the College Board. And finally, the College Board would accept a reference to political culture, but it would have to be, as a source of legitimacy, but it would have to be a specific aspect of a country's political culture. For example, in the United States, I identified for you a couple of years ago that liberty and democracy are longstanding aspects of U.S. political culture. So if you were to point out that the fact that we have competitive elections where multiple parties are free to compete, they have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of the press, and that leadership questions are resolved by elections, you could claim that certain aspects of U.S. political culture contribute to the legitimacy of our government. As long as someone is elected legally according to the rules set out in the Constitution and other laws, those leaders are legitimate. And in Russia, statism. I think I pointed out in class already that Russian political culture, a widespread belief among the Russian people is that a powerful government is necessary. It is widely accepted in Russia that the government should be so powerful that it can actually control certain aspects of the economy and social life. The fact that that exists, that belief is part of Russian culture, that belief exists among so many people, helps lend legitimacy to the very powerful Russian state. And here is a decent definition of a supranational organization. Any organization that has national governments as members and which has its own sovereign powers over those member states. There are three examples that the College Board would accept: the European Union, the World Trade Organization, and the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. In our course, of course, the UK is the only country that we study that is a member of the European Union, at least for the time being. The World Trade Organization, I believe every state we study in this course is a member of the WTO. And ECOWAS is an economic community to which Nigeria specifically belongs. So it's conceivable that on the AP Comparative Government exam you might be asked to explain the difference between causation and correlation. I'm sure this has been covered in some of your science classes, but just in case, causation's root word is cause. So you can use the word causation when you are able to say that one thing causes another thing to happen. I give you some examples there in this slide. Causation is difficult to prove, but that's why we have the scientific method. And certain things are scientifically known to cause other things, and in those situations you can use the word cause or causation. Unfortunately, some people have forgotten their science lessons in high school, and they'll believe things are causation when they're actually only correlated. So correlation simply means that two things happen at the same time. I'm going to give you some silly examples there. Basically, I think this is probably pretty easy, two easy things to keep straight. So, yeah, make sure you get these kind of questions right. There. Moving on. It's quite possible that these two words are new to you. Normative, maybe focus on the word normal. So if a statement is a normative statement, then someone is claiming that something is normal or usual or correct according to their subjective point of view. So normative statements are opinion-based. Empirical statements, on the other hand, are based on science. They can be tested. They can be checked out on an experimental basis. So normative statements are opinion-based. Empirical statements are fact-based. And there's two examples, one of each, right there on the slide. And finally, again, you probably covered all this kind of stuff in your science classes, but a hypothesis is basically a prediction, a statement that proposes a relationship between two variables. And the variables are the things that can change in relation to each other. There's two examples right there. One is kind of from actual science, one is from political science. Science is great, but political science is more fun. At least that's my normative opinion. See you back in class.